think Aston Martin's biggest mistake right now is assuming that they can take the fight to Mercedes for 4th. They should be looking back at Racing Bulls for the fight for 6th. All because Racing Bulls have now 2 drivers, whereas Aston Martin have 1 driver and Lance Stroll. Mercedes, whilst they're dealing with a fundamentally flawed car, as by their own admission, are getting a better understanding with what they need to do for the W15. And in time, as well as Lewis gaining some confidence with the car, which he was able to do in Miami with his best ever result this season, they might be able to push themselves away from Aston Martin and pretty much secure 4th place. The top 3 probably a little bit of a tall order right now. Up until recently, we just assumed that everyone from Red Bull to Aston Martin would be the ones to secure points on the regular, with the bottom 5 teams maybe getting a cheeky point or 2 in case something bad happens. But now, we need to seriously look at what Racing Bulls is doing. All of their talk of aspirations for 5th place in the Constructors at the beginning of the season, they might actually happen, and give the Faenza team their best result ever. What Miami proved to be the case was that Racing Bulls was continuing the steady and consistent pace of upgrades that AlphaTauri started to implement last year. What we saw in the back end of 2023, as well as Daniel Ricciardo's return, and then injury, and then re-return, was that the upgrades were coming thick and fast. They were gaining pace. They almost got Williams for 7th place in the Constructors, and all of the work they put in at the beginning of the season, as well as all of the insight from Nick De Vries and his technical feedback, something of which that Yuki Tsunoda still holds dear to this day, means that this team can now really start to think that maybe 5th place is something they can really aspire to. It just makes me sad that De Vries was never able to capitalize on all of the feedback that he gave the team. But it's good to know that it actually yielded something. I think he would have scored points in the second half of the season if he was still around, but oh well. In 2024, that pace has not stopped, with F1 Big Data on Twitter pointing out with this chart, McLaren stunning the paddock with all of their upgrades in one race was one thing, but Racing Bulls have silently and slowly added some themselves, with Miami bringing major tweaks to the floor and the diffuser. They are now the 2nd most developed team on the grid. Upgrades, people, upgrades! But it's not like Aston Martin haven't brought anything to the party this year. They brought a huge package to Suzuka, and it worked fairly nicely, and they were able to come away from that race with a 6th place finish, thanks to Fernando Alonso, putting himself right in the mix with the McLarens, as well as beating both Mercedes drivers. On that day, in isolation, that's not too shabby. But then you gotta look at what happened with the other Aston Martin driver. Lance was simply slower, qualifying much lower than his teammate, and even though he had his moments with overtakes throughout the race, Nico Hülkenberg was ultimately able to beat him to 11th when the flag was flown. And behind the Racing Bulls of Yuki Tsunoda, who bagged a 10th place finish at his home race. As far as I'm concerned, Aston Martin are racing with one hand tied behind their back, and they have been doing so for the last couple of years. 2022 saw them being denied 6th place in the Constructors on countback with Alfa Romeo. 2023 saw them being denied 4th place because of their limitations in points and the fact they were having to rely on Fernando Alonso consistently scoring and lots of podiums, and it looks like it's going to happen again for 2024. Of course, there are moments like in Melbourne where the second hand suddenly slips its ties and is able to provide a good result in the wake of Fernando Alonso getting a penalty where he uses his hand to play shadow puppets in front of George Russell and sends him off the track, but not too long after that, it suddenly gets retied back again, and Fernando Alonso has to pick up the slack. And Miami proved to be just that. They had a torrid time of it at that Grand Prix, and even though Fernando Alonso was able to recover to 9th place and bag some points, we have to look at the reality. Aston Martin scored 2 points. They had a sloppy sprint, whereas Racing Bulls throughout the entire weekend scored 6 times more than that. 2 points to 12. That is not something you can discount. And it's not like Racing Bulls haven't had their share of maladies as well. They've been stunted and limited in terms of their potential, thanks to all the stuff that happened with Daniel Ricciardo, having 2 Grand Prix taken out of his own control thanks to Alex Albon, and then of course, you know who in China. All the while, it meant that his teammate could capitalize on his misfortune and really start off his season incredibly well. In fact, this has been Tsunoda's best start to a season ever. But now with these new upgrades coming in, and with a brand new chassis for the Australian, Ricciardo seems more assured with his lot and has staved off the criticism from the wider F1 audience, and most likely felt fired up after his Chinese challenge was curtailed by Lance Stroll, taking an interest in his rear end. Ricciardo was in the fight for points in China, but that was able to be put to bed when he was able to get 5 points in the Miami sprint. He was able to hold off a Ferrari as well, and that's got to count for something. Yes, I know that you're going to say, well, oh, he was terrible for qualifying in the race. He didn't amount to anything. That is true. But I guess this is something that we have learnt from the sprints. You get a similar situation to what Lewis Hamilton had in China, where he was great in the sprint, but relatively nowhere in the race. You gotta be careful with what you do. But regardless, you cannot take that 4th place away. He's got 5 points to his name now, and he's broken that duck. It's a huge psychological barrier shattered. He can score points. He can outclass his teammate at points. It means there is hope for Daniel Ricciardo. And there's hope for Yuki Tsunoda as well, because both drivers are now starting to think that maybe it might not be wise to focus on what Checo is doing, and instead maybe focus on what we're doing right here, and try and just make sure we're even on the F1 grid for next year. Haas gave them a little bit of a scare at the beginning of the season, but I really don't see Haas really competing for 6th place right now. 7th though, I think is perfectly doable, especially since Sauber are in the middle of changing their own team, Williams even more so, and Alpine, they may start to get a bit of a head towards Haas, but right now, it's not looking quite as rosy for them. You never know though. It does give you pause for thought, because even though Alonso did score and recover from an underwhelming Q2 performance, Lance got 17th. After getting a 10-second penalty from passing Albon illegally, and undoing all of the good work and all of the good overtakes that he had managed to muster. And because of this, Yuki Tsunoda has broken into the top 10 of the drivers' standings, whereas Lance Stroll has dropped into the bottom 10. And not that far ahead of Nico Hülkenberg. He's only 3 points behind of Lance, and Daniel is now only 4 points behind Lance. If Daniel has another great weekend and Lance flounders once more, both Racing Bull drivers could be ahead of one of the Aston Martin drivers. I'm not digging at Lance Stroll. I'm really trying to focus more on the competitiveness of Racing Bulls, and now that both drivers are starting to get a grip on what they're trying to fight for, instead of trying to fight each other. And of course, you could easily dismiss this resurgence of the Faenza team as a given, that, oh, they're only good because they're getting more RB19 inspired parts, and that is an argument that Zach Brown and McLaren is really trying to instill upon everybody, and trying to enshrine it into law in the next Concord Agreement, that no other team should have a controlling stake in another team. But right now, the team isn't, supposedly, breaking any rules, so just let them race in a way. The upgrades are coming consistently. They are working. They are getting the results. This is a far cry from where AlphaTauri was this time last year, where, at that time, 11th place was pretty much the best they could hope for, and if they got a 10th place thanks to Tsunoda, again, that would have been an utter miracle. And in terms of where they are right now, 6th place is pretty much theirs, and it might be even closer to Aston Martin had Daniel Ricciardo not gotten himself involved in these 2 incidents of this year. But fortunately for the team, Yuki Tsunoda has been able to fill in the gap, him being able to replace Pierre Gasly as being the constant, the leader, the person that everybody wants to help out, the overall good guy. Tsunoda's confidence is all too plain to see. He's loving the VCarb and believes that the car can now be consistently in the hunt for the points without the need of a top 5 team to have a mistake all the time or to retire from the race. And even though they reckon that the top 5 teams are still too fast for them, if they can rely on strategy and good luck to bag not only 10ths but also 9ths, 8ths and 7ths, then who knows, they might be able to give the 5th place team a little bit of a surprise and give them something to think about. So long as you're consistent, that's good enough. As we've seen in the past, consistency is king. It's why Nico's father Keke was able to win the 1982 title. He only won 1 Grand Prix and he still claimed the title. That's crazy. What would also enhance Yuki's confidence is that throughout the entire Grand Prix, he held his own and kept George Russell's Mercedes behind him. Yes, they're not trying to fight Mercedes right now, but the fact that on that day he could contest against George, that would have been a massive psychological boost for him. And he also scored in both sessions. Now, of course, we need to state the obvious, that even though Racing Bulls is doing well and Tsunoda and Ricciardo are held in high regard, with Helmut Marko noticing that Tsunoda is very popular with the teenage audience of F1, we still need to address that the identity of the team itself is still something that is questionable. VCarb, Visa Cash App RB, Racing Bulls RB, no matter what you want to call it. Although I did notice on the main graphics that instead of RB behind the bull, it's VCarb now, so I guess to stave off any confusion. The addition of that sponsorship money from Visa and Cash App is being put to good use, but at the cost of the team's identity, it's a bitter pill to swallow, and it's only been diminished by an even bigger affront for some with the inclusion of HP to Scuderia Ferrari's name. I still think Scuderia Ferrari HP is better than Scuderia Ferrari Mission Win Now. Yes, it's not Winnow, it's Mission Win Now. And quite clearly it didn't work, because in 2020, instead of winning now, they were more winnows or minnows because of how bad they were in the Constructors. Ugh. But the team seems to be shrugging off all of that negativity towards their name completely. Instead, they're focusing on their on-track performance, and it seems to be paying off. Daniel Ricciardo has gotten over his initial demons, and he's able to ignore all of the criticism, and has been able to get some results. Credit where credit is due, I say. Even though I think Daniel is not quite the same person that he used to be, he does have his moments, and I am pleased for him that he was able to show what he can do, like he did in Mexico last year. There are glimmers of hope here, and so long as he can contain that positivity and then channel it into his driving, then all the power to him. And as for Yuki, that's doubly so. Both drivers scoring on the same weekend is a delight for them, and that if they can get their qualifying situation improved upon, points finishes could be all the more likely. Again, I can't stress the importance of Daniel being able to hold off a Ferrari. That is something we really need to commend. And it's just such a shame that Daniel really didn't go in the right direction for the setup, or better yet, just left the setup alone. Now, I'm not saying that Aston Martin are in dire straits right now, far from it. Their future is looking incredibly optimistic. The deals that they managed to secure are remarkable. Getting a works deal with Honda, that's amazing. Taking over from what Red Bull did. And we all saw what Red Bull were able to do with Honda. I'm really excited about that. And then all the stuff that's happening with Aramco. Yes, of course, Aramco is a questionable sponsor, but the amount of effort that they are ploughing into their sustainable fuel campaign and what they plan to do with Honda and Aston Martin is not something you should ignore. That is something that's going to be really spicy when that comes online fully for 2026. Both Honda and Aramco are wanting to go for the title, especially Honda, since they've had the title for many years now. I know it's Red Bull powertrains for the last couple of years, but it's still Honda inspired. Not to mention that they got one of the most talented F1 drivers of all time behind them for the rest of his natural life. Their long-term future looks bright, but their present though, that's looking a little cloudy. In the here and now, Aston Martin are not troubling the top three teams. Ferrari, Red Bull and McLaren are looking odds on to be scrapping for the top prize, and fourth place could easily slip away from the green team if Mercedes sort themselves out. Let's be clear here, Aston Martin are not in trouble in terms of their upgrade pass. They've got some coming for the next race, and that might be enough to keep back Racing Bulls and bring them back closer again to Mercedes, so we might be able to see them being able to respond. But then again, as we saw in Canada last year, their upgrade path could easily go awry and then see themselves scrabbling again to get back to where they were, and that happened only until Qatar last year. Then they were able to get back to where they should be. But regardless, they really need to start paying more attention to Racing Bulls because they are catching up, and they probably would be even closer had Kevin Magnussen not gotten in the way for Yuki Tsunoda in Jeddah, and also taken Yuki out in China. But it's not like Racing Bulls will be left lost at sea. Imola is a very good stomping ground for both of their drivers, and they'll have a lot more data about what the floor and diffuser could offer them, because remember, they really couldn't get much data because it was a sprint weekend, and that's why I don't really like the idea of bringing major upgrades to sprint weekends, because you barely get any practice time. Yes, the sprint gives you some more data, but again, setups between the sessions, it's a little bit sketchy. Now though, they'll be able to dial it more in, and we could see some good results because Daniel, he does like Imola, he got a podium for Renault in 2020, and he got a decent 6th place finish for McLaren. And as for Yuki, he was able to get a points finish the following year with the AT03, which was a troubled car, which finished 9th in the Constructors, so a 7th place for the 9th fastest car. That's pretty good. I think both drivers and the team can sense the tide and that it might be changing in their favour. And if this upgrade path continues, and they can steadily bring upgrades that work all the time, they can close the gap to Aston Martin so that they don't have to rely on misfortune from Aston to give them better points. That's why it's imperative that these upgrades Aston Martin bring to the Emilia-Romagna Grand Prix work, and that we don't see what happened in Montreal happen again. And that's not the only reason to be excited about Imola. This Grand Prix, the next one, is going to decide what happens in this season and what we could expect. Because Ferrari are bringing upgrades. Red Bull are rushing in upgrades of their own. Both McLaren cars will be kitted with the package that we saw in Miami work so well. It's going to be spicy. Don't miss it. And if you subscribe to this channel, you'll find yourself clued up with everything you need to know about that Grand Prix and why you'll be so excited. If Aston Martin's upgrades in Imola work and they can claw themselves back to Mercedes, then fair enough. It does make me think though. If those Canadian upgrades had worked and we saw Aston Martin progress and maintain their stature of second or third fastest team, then we might have seen McLaren's efforts be not enough to get themselves up the path of the Constructors, and they would have still remained 5th place despite all of the podiums that they managed to accrue and all of those points, them being one of the fastest cars in the second half of the season. All the efforts of Alonso at the first half of the season would have been enough to keep them in 3rd place. 4th at worst. And like I said, both Yuki and Daniel seem to have changed their tack and what they are aiming for, and instead they are looking to their team and trying to improve them, so that means they can get up the pecking order and gain some more prize money at Aston Martin's expense. And because of that, it's given them the best weekend. And at Aston Martin though, again, they are having to rely on the efforts of one fantastic driver and one that seems to be slowly ending up out of his depth. There's nowhere to hide anymore. This team is no longer the plucky Silverstone team with a mindset that they can punch above their weight. They are meant to be a heavy hitter. They're meant to be right at the top. They have aspirations to be there. They have the facilities that McLaren, Ferrari, and Mercedes would look at and go, not bad, nice. They're going to have major backers and shareholders scrutinizing every single thing they do and making sure that it's optimal and that there are no inefficiency whatsoever, because if they are, they will call it out and look for them to be purged. Papa Stroll cannot protect his son as well anymore, and him starting early talks supposedly with outside investors to sell a quarter of the team is not really helping Lance's case. And the way I see it, him selling a part of the F1 team is probably to reduce the depths of the car division, because right now it's not looking that great in terms of debt. But as a consequence of that, Papa Stroll will have less control over the overall team. Honda and Aramco have big aspirations, and they are going to be questioning the current lineup, that it might not be the most optimal lineup that Aston Martin could produce, especially if they want to be front runners. Yes, Lance Stroll might have the raw talent, but does he have the drive? Does he have the hunger? It's not looking like that anymore, because we've seen on the radio, we've seen him in interviews that he's just there, whereas Alonso is driven, hungry, and even though he is touting the party line and supporting and bigging up his teammates as much as possible, he knows what side of his bread is buttered, that's what you must do to remain with the team. And there are now rumblings that maybe his commitment to the team wasn't as one-sided after all. There might have been some cajoling, what with Carlos Sainz being around on the market. But that's only speculation and hearsay at the moment, but you know, it does have some logic. But is Lance the one to really step up now that this team is thinking big and that he can really take pride in what he has and use his experience with the team to their benefit? Well, I mean, if he can, then fair enough, and therefore all the power to him. But if he can't, and he continues to flounder and drag the team down, just like he has done over the past couple of seasons, if he'd just scored a few more points, Aston Martin might have had 6th in 2022, and they might have had 4th in 2023, and really denied McLaren the glory of being able to get themselves back up to 4th. And if this happens again in 2024, and Mercedes just slips out of their fingers for 4th place in the Constructors, and then Racing Bulls comes racing past them for 5th place, then questions are going to get even louder, and that Papa Stroll might have no choice but to replace his son, or maybe move him up to the hypercar division, as many people are speculating, and probably seems to be the best thing to do if you want to keep Lance Stroll involved in racing at all. It would be time to think about what the long-term future is for Aston Martin. Honda and Aramco will not be impressed at what they could expect when they come on board for 2026. If Lance is still there and taking up a seat, which could easily be filled with brand new talents that might come through F2, or talent that's currently in F1 suddenly becoming available, then, you know, it's not really looking good in terms of commitment from the boss. Mike Crack, the team principal, will have to come up with the speech of his life to convince them to keep Lance, which is something he's been doing on overdrive this year, and then admitting that the only reason the team exists in its current entity is because of the boss's son. Something of which I talk more about in this video here that you can hop over to right now. I'll see you there.